Good afternoon. I am Bunny Ellerin, the CEO of DHNY Digital Health New York, and wanted to welcome you to today's webinar, which is all around real-world evidence and GenAI, and using GenAI to realize the potential of healthcare data. So without further ado, I'd like to bring on our three fabulous panelists. We have Lauren Becknell from Pfizer. We have Dr. Ing Ho from Veradigm, and Gaurav Kaushik, also from Veradigm. Why don't each of you just take a minute to give a brief introduction so we know who's who? Ing, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. This is something that the three of us have been talking for quite some time about. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Ing Ho. I'm the interim CEO of Veradigm, and I have been in this space in health information tech around pharma, life sciences, and data analytics for over 25 years. And it's really a pleasure to be here to have an opportunity to talk about a new advance in technology, but more importantly, ability to be able to really harness data and analytics in a way we haven't before. So thank you.
Lauren?
Thank you. Just echoing Ing's sentiment, we are very excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity today, Bunny, to speak to everyone who has joined. So my name is Lauren Becknell. I am leading real-world evidence strategy, business operations, and some other components of my title. But think of me as a real-world evidence lead within Pfizer, amongst a platform of very talented colleagues. My background, of course, I've been in industry for about 6 years now. Prior to that, spent time in healthcare and academia, as well as doing some contracts for the federal government for FDA, NCI, and other research institutions. So very excited to be here and talk about a topic that's very near and dear to our hearts.
Gaurav?
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. I'm Gaurav Kaushik. I lead artificial intelligence at Veradigm now. I've been working in machine learning from the bench to the bedside for over 15 years. And a lot of my expertise has been looking at ways in which AI systems can facilitate us understanding data that we're collecting from electronic health record systems, from diagnostics platforms, and figuring out ways in which we can further medical research. And prior to Veradigm, I was the founder of Science.io, where we worked on healthcare-specific artificial intelligence. And before that, I was leading the real-world data team at Foundation Medicine, a cancer diagnostics firm, helping them scale up how we learn from each cancer patient's journey and improve cancer care. So excited to be here today.
Fantastic. So we've got the dream team to talk about this topic, and I'm excited to get started. So on that note, there are a lot of different definitions floating around real-world evidence, real-world data. Lauren, can you explain how real-world data and evidence are used at Pfizer and kind of what your definition is?
Absolutely. So happy, of course, to distribute. There are some common standard definitions for these things that the FDA and other global standards development organizations, et cetera, have put out. But today, what I'll do is kind of share in common vernacular what I think of when I think about real-world data and evidence, and then talk briefly about how we use these things within Pfizer. So data is often referred to as, kind of this gold mine, but also the crude oil. In order to have something that you can process and find usable, there are a lot of steps in this metaphor to get from crude oil to gasoline or to other, petroleum-based products. Very true for real data as well. We have a number of sources of real-world data. They include things like electronic medical records or electronic health records more broadly. Claims data, these may be open or closed claims where they've been adjudicated and paid out. We might have information from social media. Recently, we have used quite frequently data from sewage treatment facilities looking at COVID variants and other viral variants that we can find there, and many, many other sources. In short, these are all of the data that we generate as humans and as patients through normal course of living our lives or through receiving care. They're different from traditional interventional trials, wherein we are conducting usually a randomized control trial or some other form of trial where it's very structured, often not very generalizable. So very specific populations addressing a very specific scientific question. However, that method gives us the cleanest, most direct signal that we can know and trust and make decisions based off of. So interventional trials are always likely to be the gold standard when we think in particular about regulatory evidence. However, the importance of real-world data and real-world evidence comes in helping to fill some of the gaps that are left within those trials. So, for example, you may have a trial on a rare disease population with, say, 30 patients, or a more common population of cardiovascular patients of, say, 10, 30,000 patients. However, we know that the global population or even national populations for some of these diseases may be in the tens to hundreds of thousands or even millions of patients. Therefore, it's not really reasonable to expect that any trial can fully represent all patients who may receive benefit from a product or where there may be some rare safety signals. That's where we use this very disparate breadth of different types of real-world data to understand what is happening in the population at large and to start to pull out and to understand how are medicines and therapies, other interventions being used in a real-world medical setting, and then what are the outcomes and benefits or risks to patients in an actual real-world medical setting. So if real-world data is that crude substrate, wherein we know that some of that data is accurate, but that the best copy of what is happening with a patient is actually in the mind of a treating physician. Some of that intelligence is documented in notes, some of it may be in structured forms. But we have to understand that there may be very specific reasons why a patient may have one diagnosis, but be coded in a slightly different way. It could be that the physician, for example, is trying to avoid financial toxicity for the patient. It may be that they know that with a particular insurer, using a certain code may be more likely to get the coverage and rapid approval that they need, or a million other things. And so I bring this up just as one example of the types of bias that can be implicitly coded in real-world data. In addition to things like, you must understand how physicians that are practicing in academic medical centers may treat their patients in very different ways than physicians who are treating largely indigent patients, say at county hospitals or at sites of community practice. All of those things are valid. They're all incredibly valuable to us from a data perspective. But in order to generate evidence, that's actually the science and the output, right? You have to understand what are the different forms of bias in the data, what are appropriate methods to apply to address your scientific question, and then how do you appropriately interpret the output of that? And so together, I would say that's real world evidence. Finally, I'd say insights, very fast, not based on a protocol, still somewhat science driven, but it's something that you can use to generate hypotheses or to inform business decisions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Gaurav, the other part of our webinar is really all about Gen AI. Obviously, there's a lot of hype out there and a lot of discussion. How do you define Gen AI, and how is it different from other AI and machine learning approaches, particularly in this instance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big fan of demystifying these algorithms because you can understand them. And when you understand them, you know how you can affect their behavior and use them in responsible ways. So here's the framework that I tend to use. Generative AI is kind of an umbrella term for a set of algorithms that can create new content. So you've seen a lot of text generation, generative AI, image generation, even audio and video generation. And the way that they can do this is by learning from data that they are presented with in a few different ways. And what's cool about generative AI is that a lot of other AI approaches or machine learning approaches tend to focus on a single task. So you might be looking at a patient's records and figuring out, you know, what their ICD code or CPT code is, or making a prognosis. You may be optimizing some sort of a process. Generative models can multitask, basically because they can take any sort of arbitrary input. They can do lots of things flexibly. And so there's benefits that come with that. There's also risks. So a lot of what we focus on are language models, which are specifically text generation models. And so if you use ChatGPT or you use smaller language models like Llama, then you know what these models are capable of. In terms of demystifying how these models are created, there's really 3 ways in which we train them. And each one is super important at introducing new knowledge to the model and then teaching it how to behave. So I think everyone generally appreciates that these models train on a lot of unlabeled data. So we can just provide them large volumes of text and we can ask them to do simple things, like we could remove a word and ask them to fill in the blank, or we could give them the first sentence of a paragraph and have them try to predict the rest of the paragraph. And what's actually happening when we ask these models to do that is they form a very rough understanding of the rules of language. There's good research that shows that they learn things like syntax, and they learn statistical associations between different words. So if you give them a lot of healthcare data, they'll start to associate different medical conditions with the diagnoses that are applied or the therapeutics that are used to treat them. But that's very rough, right? They have the ability to do basic autocomplete, but how do you get them to do something very specific with that understanding? So we then take it to the second stage where we give them an input and an expected output. So you can say, here's an article. Can you summarize it? Here's what a good summary looks like. Or you can say, here's my question. Here's my expected answer. And so the models learn to essentially use those like general rules and try to learn to do something very specific. And the last, and arguably I would say the most important step, is to teach them to do that in a way that is useful to the user and that avoids toxic or biased behaviors. And that's a step called alignment. So people are actually fundamental to how we train generative language models. They need feedback to tell them, what is the ideal answer? If you ask me to do something, what's the best way that I can do it? Or do you want me to give you things that potentially are not safe, right? If you productize something and somebody asks a question like, how can I make a bomb? Do you want me to answer that or not? And, you know, that's an extreme example, but that is one of the ways in which we can confine what these models are doing and what they're capable of doing. So you have the flexibility of having a lot of different things that these models can do. We can give them basic facts, we can teach them to do specific things, and we can teach them to behave the way we'd like them to. And the reason why this is so powerful in healthcare is because there's a lot of information, tasks, and behaviors that are specific to how we want to provide care, how we provide care, and how we learn from the care that's provided so that we can improve patient care long term. And you're not going to see that in a public domain. You're not going to see that by scraping GitHub or by scraping Reddit. And you're not going to see a kind of alignment that you would expect to see that aligns with what patients want, what physicians want from third-party applications. So a lot of what we're focused on is how can we take a lot of these powerful tools and bring them closer to the data that is coming out of the EHRs and put them in the hands of the experts that are going to be the ones that are driving the next generation of care and also the future of real-world data and real-world evidence.
I'm glad that you brought up the EHR and data there, because you and Gaurav are with Veradigm, and Veradigm is known as an EHR company, bills, claims processing, etc. So what is it about real world data, real world evidence that is of interest to you?
I mean, thank you. That actually, we're a company that actually works with not just EHRs, but also with payers and life sciences. But EHR is the roots of Veradigm and probably the largest part of our organization. One of the things that I think is exciting about working around generative AI at this point is that at the end of the day, EHR is a key source of real world data, because it really is a data origination place. It's where patient data is captured, the clinical encounter is captured, the context is captured there. And that's what makes this exciting, because by doing so, all of the things that both Lauren and Gaurav talked about, what is actually happening, why decisions were made, what were the assumptions, they're all captured within the electronic health record. And so if you think of that as the source material for getting a real understanding of what is actually happening at a more longitudinal way, or in a more in a subpopulation, or even at a population way around outcomes, treatment patterns, healthcare utilization, this is what makes this extremely exciting. What's exciting about this moment in time is the fact that you can now start to apply generative AI type of models to start to organize this information, to abstract the information so that we can start asking the questions that we want to ask of it. That's all what research has always been about, right? Learning how to ask questions based on the information that we have. But if the information is kind of scattered, maybe not organized in a way that's easy for us to like consume it so that we can actually determine whether we're seeing a pattern, that is one of the reasons why things take a long time. I think that this is actually a nice leap for us at this point to think about the fact that as a data originator, we actually are have data that is going to be the source material that can be used to train a model. And then also our physicians who use the EHRs are actually part and parcel of the expertise that's required to help understand the quality of that data. And then research on the other side has the ability to start asking questions. So it's a really beautiful kind of like flywheel, if you think of it that way, and a real opportunity for all to learn. I think one of the things that makes this exciting for us is that if you think about it, physicians are actually an even more active part of research in this case, because they have always been collecting the information and using it to take care of their patients. Imagine the fact that this information starts getting abstracted in a way that's also useful for their pattern recognition and their ability to contribute to the hypothesis thinking that exists within the larger research the research ecosystem. And I think that that's probably the most exciting part about it. So I would say that EHRs absolutely should be at the forefront of this as this next sort of source of data. And for us at Veradigm, a large part of it is just because of the fact that we can sort of see how it plays its way out. This data, as kind of like what Lauren was saying, isn't necessarily the only data that is real world data. There's other data that you can start to link with it, but a really good source of it comes out of EHRs. And that's why we're excited about it.
Well, you mentioned quality of data, right? And how important that is. EHRs, sometimes don't have, they're known to be messy, or they're known to be just for billing, etc. So how can you build trust in the data that is provided? And this really goes to everybody in terms of data quality and the importance.
I think all three of us are here because we've believed for a long time that data quality is the basis by which we make so many of our hypotheses and our research analysis from. And so in some sense, that commitment has been always there. The idea is, you're right, you're capturing information. It's like taking notes, right? It's taking notes, and some of it is structured and some of it is just really your thoughts inside of like a unstructured clinical note. What I think is exciting about it is you don't want to change people's ability of actually capturing information. What you want to be able to do is make it so that the information as it is being captured gains a structure with it, that you can apply a structure to it, abstract it, so that it becomes where you can start to harmonize information in a way where 5 different people will say 5 different things, the same thing in 5 different ways. Now you can actually organize them in a way where they are talking about the same type of symptoms. They're talking about the same kind of treatment patterns. They're talking about the same things that they're observing. And I think that that's where it becomes exciting for research. So we're not trying to necessarily change the way someone thinks. What we're actually trying to do is enhance the way their data quality is at the moment when they're actually capturing it, and then at the same time support its ability to be analyzed when you are looking at it from a hypothesis-driven research orientation. But I'd like to open it up, because I honestly, that's just sort of my perspective, but I think data quality definitely the linchpin of this whole thing.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I think what you would probably have violent agreement from this panel also In addition to everything that Ian just said, is that we know that we have to reach a state where we're mindful of data quality. We're helping to improve that, make structured data elements where possible, but to do so in a way that does not interfere with or cause burdensome additional work to any provider, interrupt the flow of their relationship with their patient and the patient's own ability to understand their health and how to continue to improve it. Data quality is absolutely something, when you think about evidence, that you spend a lot of time being concerned with. You have to understand the underlying data to ensure that what outcomes you're getting out of it from a research perspective are actually accurate. There are a lot of models that you can use to identify some potential data quality issues. Certainly you can run feasibility studies and other things of that nature. But I'm very excited by any company like Veradigm and others that are thinking deeply about this issue in a way, again, that's kind of narrowing that gap of what's been called the chasm of semantic despair. In that we have research on one side, care on another side of this chasm. They often are talking about the same concepts like genes or diseases, but they may do so in very different ways. But anyone that's seeking to really fill or bridge that chasm is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, and I'll just add that one of the unique opportunities we have here at Veradigm is because we are custodians of the data, and we can trace the data all the way from EHRs to real world evidence within one organization. When we build AI systems that get better at normalizing and organizing data, outside of the EHR, we can also use them in the EHR to reduce administrative burden for physicians and improve data at the source, improve data where it's captured, so that downstream it's easier to use. One good example is if you're providing services that allow you to automatically generate a SOAP note, for example, for the physician to save them some time, we can look at what the physician does to correct the SOAP note, and we can look at the information in the SOAP note itself and capture that right at the source. And that will save a lot of effort and burden in ensuring data accuracy and quality when we're thinking about it for the purposes of real world evidence. When I talk to our RWE experts here at Veradigm, the number one thing they say is if you can improve the quality and the capture of data in the EHR, that will improve my ability to learn from each patient's experience. And so being able to do all of that under one roof is pretty exciting.
So some of the specific use cases for GenAI, particularly with real world evidence today, what's it being used for today?
I'm happy to jump into that one. So there's really two pillars that I see most use cases falling into. One is around the clinical workflow and the provider experience. So whether it's AI that can help with practice management, like optimizing scheduling or representing information in a way that patients will resonate with more, if you're thinking about patient engagement, or it's automating some of the tasks that physicians have to do, like writing up all the notes and being able to summarize them and do data entry in the EHR, helping to tee up orders of labs and helping to pre-populate billing codes that billers and coders can essentially then work off of. There's a lot of surface area there where I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 20 years, so much of the clinical workflow is going to be AI driven. It'll probably be largely invisible too, because it'll just be working in the background, which is really exciting. And then the other piece is on organizing the data. So being able to do basic things like manage the large volumes of unstructured data coming into the healthcare ecosystem. So one statistic I've seen is that 2 zettabytes of data, 2 trillion gigabytes of data are created by the healthcare system each year, and the vast majority of it is unstructured. So if you're looking across the ecosystem to say, how many patients do we have that have a family history of heart failure, they are pre-diabetic and they're taking a GLP-1, how can you figure out how many people those are? AI systems can help us organize the data to be able to understand who those patients are, and then look at the other factors influencing their current health status, their care, and their potential path forward. So, everything basically falls into those two buckets. Anything else to add?
I'd say from the industry perspective, all of those things very true. We're finding a lot of use already from generative AI technologies, whether it is helping to create a skeleton of a paper that's summarizing evidence, for example. We had a question come in about how are our life science companies speeding up that time from study design to actual answers. Generative AI is one of the things that many companies like Pfizer and others are doing, wherein if you have a set of protocols, which we all have, and we're documenting those things, that's a huge body of knowledge and information to train models on. And therefore, you can start to have stubs of protocols that you can then fill in and tailor to a specific scientific question. You can start to do the same thing for things like budget impact models and value dossiers for health technology authorities and for payers. We're doing a lot of this right now and have been really impressed with the speed and efficiency at which we've been able to adapt and adopt these technologies to gain speed. Also, I would say we are using them when it comes to coding in some ways. So I wouldn't say that it's the most robust or sophisticated mechanism to develop code, but certainly where you have things like, business development assessments, where you're trying to vet the veracity of a company's self-valuation and some of their inputs, your long-range forecasts, even just addressing some basic questions like treatment patterns. You can train these models on historic code so that it can then be deployed. And I think so far we've cut down some of the kind of insights generation time to about 90 to 95% of what it used to be in certain applications. And that's really exciting because it frees up everyone's time to do the higher order, higher impact work.
I guess probably the use case I'm most excited about is the fact that since most EHR data is unstructured information, the clinical note, which contains so much information, think of like COVID patients when they were basically presenting and saying that they had lost their sense of smell, that was never going to be captured in a structured field. It was going to be captured somewhere in a note. These types of things that start showing up, the idea that we can begin to use models, generative AI, to actually structure the information at scale is the part that I think is the most exciting, because that actually just lifts it for everyone, particularly on the research side. And I know that this has been for years something we've had to do purely with humans. Curating it's very labor intensive, takes a lot of people to do it, armies of people. And if we can start to take away that aspect of the abstraction and use human expert oversight to ensure that the quality of the abstraction is correct, we are going to make this an incredibly efficient approach to abstracting and structuring unstructured information in a scale that we haven't seen before. That I think is the most exciting of the use cases we have at the moment, because it's going to benefit everyone.
Well, when you're talking about humans, right, obviously there's a lot of room for error. And we've heard in AI around hallucinations, right, where something is said that is not so, which could certainly happen from a lot of unstructured data. What should folks think about vis-a-vis hallucinations and how that may impact the data?
Yeah, I'm happy to field that one. So for folks who aren't familiar with the term, hallucinations refers to when a generative AI model will make a very confident statement that's actually not true. Like you might ask ChatGPT about some sort of a scientific topic, and it'll give you citations that you go to PubMed and they're just not there. So it is a risk to be aware of, because hallucinations can seem very realistic. Right? It's the goal of the model to give you an output that feels like it was written by a person. But models don't always have a built-in way to differentiate what they're generating from factual statements. And so there's concrete ways, though, in which we can mitigate the risk from hallucination. So some of them are, basic, like be clear in the way that you are asking the model for information. Don't ask it for things that you know that there is a hallucination risk. When you think about building models, having people review the outputs, especially for high stakes use cases, to measure the hallucination rate, teach it to answer a question by saying, I don't know, instead of being confident, which is a problem many people have sometimes as they're learning in their career. But I think, to circle back to this, how we're thinking about data extraction for real world data and real world evidence. Generative AI models are going to be they are a very important component of how we think about finding out what information we have. But they're just one arrow in the quiver that you use to build a real world data set from an EHR. So combining different AI tools, including non-generative AI, that can help you get to the source of truth can be really powerful. So for example, one non-generative AI you might use is a model that you can prompt it with a question like, does this patient have a family history of XYZ? And instead of coming up with an answer, its job is to tell you where in the original record the answer to your question is. And using that, you can pull out the exact source of truth. Now, what you can do with that is then feed it to a generative model to maybe clean up or integrate with other inputs to do, a task you're asking it to do, like summarize the patient's information. But it doesn't have to always be a generative model that's giving you the information you need for the patient. And what we've seen is when we've used a combination of non-generative models and generative models, the hallucination rate goes way down. And the verbosity of the models goes way down. And physician sentiment on the output goes up. So not every problem should be solved with a generative model, and it's going to be a combination of tools that help us build, the next generation of RWD engines. But they are important, and where they are important mostly for me is you don't know what you have unless you look for it, and they're a really easy way to essentially say, do I know XYZ about a patient? You give them access to patient records and you fish for what variables you can get, and then you grab those variables in a more structured, reliable, and less hallucination prone way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think we've had a couple of questions as well, Gaurav, about really there are two that have come in kind of playing on what we brought up before about how there are very specific reasons why providers may choose certain codes in an EHR, not that they're inaccurate, but that they best represent the way that that particular provider deems giving best care to their patient. And so I think any questions about, does this mean that payments come through and that the data are wrong? How do you begin to think about this when we're talking about now applying generative AI models that might themselves hallucinate? Aren't we kind of stacking error on top of error? It's not to say that that cannot happen. However, with any patient record at an individual level or at a population health record level, we're looking at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of patients in some cases. It's very important to not treat any one datum, any one piece of data within a medical record, claims, or any other source of real world data as the Bible, right? It's just one note or one element of a patient's health and a patient's care. Instead, what we have to do is to look across longitudinally the available data that we have on a given patient or a given cohort of patients to look for trends and to look for commonalities. There are methods that you can apply to look and see where things are outliers and likely to be errors. So for example, we know that problem lists can themselves be problematic, or maybe there is an error and someone put in that, Lauren has a latex allergy, and perhaps that's inaccurate, but it might carry forward into other provider notes. There are ways that we can tend to find these things where they're clinically material and to adjust for them. Also, when you're thinking about really strong evidence, kind of regulatory grade real world evidence, you have to go in and look at not only not a single piece of data within a patient's record, but think often about multiple pieces of data that are used to really represent complex medical concepts. So in oncology, for example, progression and response. These are things that are incredibly important for both researchers and for patients and providers to understand, is this treatment likely to work? Or is this treatment working if I've given it to one of my patients? Very important. But often these are not structured. They're not in any one place. You're going to have to look at imaging records. You're going to have to look at provider notes. You're going to have to look at treatment switches, dose modifications, drug holidays, all of those things. And then work with experts, both from a statistical perspective as well as a clinical perspective, to take all of these things into account and to create a story that is best fit for the data and also most accurate with what we know for treatment outcomes.
Yeah, if I could just plus one something you said, Lauren, especially in oncology, right? The same ICD code can apply to a very treatable form of cancer and a form of cancer that has a much lower 5-year survival rate. So knowing that billing codes are not diagnostic codes is so important. And I think that, when I was at Foundation Medicine, for example, people would look at the data and say, hey, this was the diagnosis, so why did they get this drug? And all I can say is that physicians make they have a diverse set of treatment decisions. The data needs to be accurate, but the behavior in the data may not always be consistent. What's important is, as a data provider, we give you all the data points so you can understand what's happening in the healthcare system and then make your own conclusions about the way treatment plans are being put together and what outcomes look like as a consequence of that. And if you see inconsistencies, it could be because healthcare is inconsistent.
Or individualized, right?
Or individuals, yes, absolutely.
So far, we talked about the patient, but we've talked a lot about the provider providing the information, right, in the EHR. And, there's patients have become much more engaged in their own healthcare as well as their caretakers. Is there an opportunity for GenAI to bolster that? We have a great question around, between visits to add to the information. Where's the patient in all of this?
Like at the end of the day, it's where it really comes down to the centricity around patients, right? It's their data. Or it's not much their data. It is a capture of what happened to them, and it is a capture of what they are suffering and how they are responding. But patients themselves are also a source of information, right? They are the ones who can tell you exactly what is happening to them time-wise. We have seen this over the years in patient-reported outcomes and diaries and a lot of different ways. But the more we have the capability of creating structured pathways or pathways to make information structured, that gives us the ability to also add other information that can come from other sources like patients. And that suddenly means that the data sets that get created or abstracted become richer. I think that in some sense, generative AI actually helps all data sources if you begin to start to move in a very responsible way to create structured, abstractive approaches to information, and then use that as kind of like the rails by which other information can start to basically be included or linked into it. And I think that that's where it starts to really make a difference. But absolutely, I think the patient's voice will get more enhanced as a data source as we start to be able to abstract more and more unstructured data, of which some of their data actually ends up sometimes in that bucket.
Yeah. We have a few questions as well about how Pfizer or industry at large is using real world data across the value chain and, the drug development or other therapy development life cycle. Those are great questions. I would say one of the things that we were very proud of, our UK team, just as one example, I think published 15 papers with patients in a single year period. So as Ing was saying, there's not only this tremendous benefit for generative AI working with patients, structuring the data that they're giving us, and being able to interrogate that in new ways and maybe actually interacting with the patients to verify some of those impressions or to firm them up where patients maybe aren't sure what happened 6 years ago. That's all very exciting. But as is this notion of having patients at the center, not only of the data, but also of the studies that we're doing, how we're designing things, and making sure that, their voice is very centered on all of the work that we do, while we're continuing to think about generating evidence for medical to medical communications with providers, obviously for regulators, for payers, and for other stakeholders. And so we have integrated this at multiple points in our value chain, both from a patient centricity perspective. So very early on in the life cycle, in early R&D, we have a team that thinks about medical information and kind of regulatory quality, patient-reported outcomes, and patient impressions of unmet need, for example. That continues all the way through. When something is post-approval, of course, then we're very keen to understand, how are patients interacting with the medication? What are they finding valuable? What are their concerns? And packaging this up. But I'd say in general, how's industry using real world data? Well, in R&D, I think you'll find that real world data is used for insights generation very frequently. And this is the easiest place to calculate ROI for real world data for a life sciences company, because it's very straightforward to say, we ran this protocol through and we're able to say 14 of the 17 eligibility criteria not only are unnecessary and limit the study and the trial to the number of patients that could derive benefit from this, but also are not contributing to the bottom line safety profile of a study. So get rid of them. They're not helpful, right? You can then calculate out how much more rapidly are you able to recruit patients. Obviously, there is a ton of work that many companies have put into smart site identification, smart patient enrollment, really that kind of mechanical or operational efficiency, as well as things like informing clinical pharmacology studies, or even outright avoiding having to run some trials. There's one example internally where a team member of ours partnered closely with our R&D colleagues to avoid what would have been a $600 million clinical trial that would have provided really data of no benefit. We were able to see the same outcomes and results through real world data. It's maybe a little bit more difficult to calculate some return on investment for things that are more typically in the realm of medical affairs or commercial sometimes. So what I mean by that is often you'll think about generating real world evidence and publishing that within a paper. It's hard to say what is the value of any given paper. Obviously, when a paper is picked up and it's referenced within an HTA assessment, that's something that you can directly point to from an access perspective. Where it's included as either prima facie evidence and driving part of a regulatory submission, or in the context, and we can say, well, gosh, maybe the trial didn't quite hit its alpha, but directionally the data were quite positive. And then with the additional real world evidence as context, that totality of evidence can in some cases be enough for regulators to make decisions towards approval in a way that they wouldn't in the absence of that information. But it can be challenging. Like if we're coming up with evidence-based promotional materials to inform and power medical to medical conversations, or to generate leave behinds, even to put into commercials for marketing perspectives, that can be kind of hard to sometimes immediately measure. But I think there are ways that we go about thinking about that in terms of a number of different metrics. And if folks have questions about how we think about that value, whether it's qualitative or quantitative in that commercial space, happy to take any questions offline and continue the conversation.
Awesome. Gaurav, not to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. You mentioned earlier that you worked at Foundation Medicine and with Flatiron Health, which led you to start an AI company, Science.io. So how are those connected?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, first of all, my experience at Foundation and Flatiron was great. If any of my colleagues are here, would love to catch up. I think something that I was really impressed by in my time there was how much untapped potential there really is to understand each patient's journey. And when you just start to ask questions, it becomes incredibly overwhelming what you don't know about healthcare. And, I was there at the time where Opdivo and Pembro they were just starting to see uptake. And so you could see things in the data like patients who were receiving therapies that were not FDA approved, that was off label, but seeing response. And it was pretty shocking. So some of the things Lauren spoke to, and being able to see patients with unmet needs, even get to the point where you may not even have to run a trial arm because there's such overwhelming evidence. We saw that in practice. One example, without naming the organization, we were able to provide real world data and evidence for a number of patients that was roughly 2 to 3 times more than they had in the original trial, to the FDA. So, it's also like from a numbers perspective, when you're dealing with very rare populations, every single patient's journey is important to learn from. However, I also saw how hard it is to operationalize RWD on top of EHR systems. And when you have a reliance on manual workflows, how limiting that can be from, just an operations perspective, but, that translates into patient outcomes. If we can't get the data organized, we can't learn from the data, we can't help patients. So Science.io was started around the time that the original BERT paper was published. I remember sitting at my desk and reading it and seeing that these new class of neural networks were coming out that would allow us to build AI systems that could continuously learn from each patient journey. And some of the things we were doing at Foundation was training neural networks on very large patient populations and then showing that we could fine tune them on smaller patient populations and get more accurate results faster. So the goal is, how can we scale up what we were doing on RWD in 2018 to actually understand every patient's journey in the United States? And I think us joining Veradigm has been really exciting because this is one of the unique places where we can actually bring the data source and the artificial intelligence together to create that kind of RWD ecosystem, where patients are heard and we can do things that improve their healthcare experience. So that'll help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing we haven't really touched on is this concept of responsible AI, and all kinds of consortiums have been formed, particularly in healthcare, with lots of folks around the idea of responsible AI. So and maybe we'll start with you. Where does that come in?
I think at the end of the day, it's generative AI is a model, right? You're basically teaching a model that to help you organize or abstract or do those types of tasks. So you have to be able to trust the model, and you have to trust how you taught the model. I think the most important thing about thinking about responsible AI is asking the right questions. How are you handling the data that is being that the model is being trained on? What is the quality of the data that you are training this model on? Where was the source of the data? How do you solve for the things that might be inaccurate? Who's teaching it? So in the same way you train on data, you also have to teach it, because the model also has to learn. And that's where the human expert makes such a huge difference. Start making corrections. Sometimes the corrections are very simple corrections. Maybe it's a syntax, maybe it's made out of order. Sometimes it's an erroneous kind of jump. But the thing is that as you start to keep doing that, the models get better and better and better, and they get faster, and they start to become part of a workflow. And I think that it's because of that perspective, you're constantly thinking about, can I trust the data that I'm teaching it with? Is the system closed so I don't have anything errant that's coming into it? And at the same time, how am I teaching it? And that's a large part of kind of the way we think at Veradigm, why we want to have generative AI in-house, is because our goal is not to utilize other AI models that we don't have control over. We're trying to ensure that we teach the models based on the information we have. And that's kind of a very specific example of being responsible. Means that you know your inputs and you know your outputs, and you can start to correct if you start to feel that it's not going in the right direction, but you're doing it with expertise. And that's where human beings make such a difference, is the human expert involvement.
I think that point about the human expert is really critical. And there actually was a question in chat about, historically, these unstructured notes, you've had to rely on expert curators. This is something that Gaurav and I have been talking a lot about with other members of my team and with the community at large, in that there are some diseases, type 2 diabetes, various common cardiac conditions, where real world data and the types of endpoints or outcomes that we think of from a research perspective, they're pretty well represented for the most part in EMR claims and other types of real world data. It gets more interesting when you're thinking about some types of rare diseases, medical dermatology, oncology, where there are research endpoints that may never be documented in common care. We just think about kind of the same outcomes in slightly different ways. Again, that chasm of semantic despair. One of the ways that we have historically as a community dealt with that in those more challenging disease areas is relying on expert curators, so physicians, nurses, and other experts, to actually go through and review and adjudicate a patient's record, looking at many disparate sources of information within that record and supplementation of that record, and then using their best clinical judgment to fill in some of those necessary structured fields, which often are efficacy or effectiveness outcomes or safety outcomes in some cases, but not always. I think something that we have spoken about quite a bit is that while this can be tremendously beneficial because you have experts making those judgments and you can document how they made those judgments, like which pieces of specific information did they use to have a particular interpretation or derivation. That's fantastic. However, there aren't an unlimited number of these human beings in the world who are willing to not practice medicine and instead work with the data and to do this kind of curation. There's also a limited amount of time that each individual has to work on a given project. And so I think we are globally either rapidly reaching a point where we have saturated that resource, or we're very quickly going to come to that point. And so I can't say that I know that generative AI, either large or small language models, can hit that out of the park for every disease indication. But I think we're very interested in learning where can these models be trained using that expert human opinion, even at the site of care in some cases, having that expert opinion, training the model up such that over time we can identify what are the diseases or other conditions under which we can use generative AI and other similar approaches to extract those structured data elements, and where can we not? Where does more work need to be done? That's a particularly exciting area of research. And I don't know if Gaurav or Ing, you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, I'd be happy to just add my thoughts on the responsibility piece in general. One thought that I always circle back to is that healthcare has its own intrinsic biases. We know that there are patients who receive poorer outcomes, and that often falls along demographic lines, which is unfortunate. And so one of the responsibilities we have is to not just avoid promoting those biases, but also to find ways to mitigate existing biases in healthcare. And where that starts is having a very clear eye on how these models behave. So there's a question here that says, how do you know and validate that the system is fully trained and accurate? My personal philosophy is that you need a set of functional tests that tell you how a model is going to behave in a real world setting. That means how well does it perform a task, like extracting the right information, but also pressure testing it to say, if this is a patient who happens to be African American, does your performance drop? Do you change the way you behave in terms of determining a potential diagnosis because of their demographic background? And is that appropriate? Having those kinds of additional tests is going to help us understand which systems are promoting what kinds of biases. And right now, there is no industry standard for that. So we're working on having that developed internally. And then I would personally like to see that be adopted more broadly in the industry. And as you're learning to the folks who join the webinar, you might see, oh, but somebody is using XYZ benchmarks that are out there in the market, right? Aren't those good and accurate? And what I would say is no. For example, one benchmark that is commonly used is called PubMed QA. And the way that it was curated was they assumed that every PubMed abstract that ended with a question mark is a question that's being asked. And the results section of the abstract is the answer to that question. And when you dig into that benchmark, you realize that that is completely incoherent, but we're training medical language models on the assumption that that is a good test of their functionality. And so sometimes there's an overemphasis on the metric versus what it's actually going to do when you put it into a real system. And so there's work to do as an industry for us to ensure that we have clear and unbiased tests for generative models, and that that is inclusive of the stakeholders that are benefiting from EHR data and models that learn from them. I don't know if that answered
Wow.
your question, Lauren, but it's very top of mind for me.
We only have a couple of minutes left. We've covered a lot of ground in just about an hour. So before we leave, I want each of you quickly to say, what is one thing, if you remember one thing from today's webinar, what should that be? Either around real world data or Gen AI or the combination of the two? Ing, let's start with you.
I would like to say that the one thing I want everyone to kind of take away from today, and thank you everyone for this panel discussion, is the idea to be careful and think about the responsibility of what it means to like train models, and about what it means for all of us when you start to add more information, start to abstract it, start to structure it. How will that help us? Constantly asking questions about how this will work is how we're going to move forward as an industry and as a population around what responsible generative AI in the face of being able to develop the data that will support us in a research enterprise will be.
Lauren?
I would say.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said
Lauren or
Gaurav.
Gaurav?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gaurav.
Oh, thanks, Lauren. I apologize. I would just say keep the patient at the center of what you do. They are the ones who, are creating the data, and they're the ones that ultimately should benefit from the data. And then us, along the way, want to benefit our providers and other stakeholders as well. But it begins and ends with the patient.
Could not agree more with the sentiments of both of my colleagues here. Fantastic points. The only thing that I would add is there is tremendous potential in what we can do with real world evidence, what we can do with generative AI, and many, many other types of methods that we haven't touched upon, or technologies that we haven't touched upon. However, we should always be very mindful not only of keeping patients at the center of what we do, but of the dreaded hype curve, and where any of these technologies, approaches, or data sets are on that hype curve. There will be things that come out that we learn that will continue to be incredibly powerful. There will be things that we learn maybe that didn't work quite as well as we thought, and we need to either adapt it or abandon it entirely. So you will always get a result out of real world data. It doesn't mean that that result is actual evidence or that it's meaningful. So please, please, please work with the qualified epidemiologists and set of statisticians who really understand the data, who really understand the technology and the methods, so that you can trust, and that more importantly, patients and providers can trust the evidence that's being put out there.
Well, with that, we are just at 1 o'clock. So I want to thank our panelists, Lauren, Ing, and Gaurav, and thank our audience. And we hopefully will see some of you at our next event on May 14th. But for now, have a great rest of the day. Thank you all.